They laughed when a 16-year-old boy filled his yard with broken beehives that everyone else had thrown away. They called him Bee Boy and said he was trying to save an entire valley with insects. 7 months later, something happened that no one in Briar Glen had ever witnessed. Thousands of wild bees descended from the sky and chose the very hives they had mocked. By autumn, orchards that had been dying for years were bending beneath the heaviest harvest anyone could remember. This isn't just the story of a boy who saved an orchard. It's the forgotten frontier lesson that proved the smallest creatures can change an entire community if someone is willing to believe before anyone else does. By the time the first apple blossoms opened across Briar Glen, nearly every farmer in the valley had forgotten the boy they once called a scavenger. They remembered him only when the branches began to bend beneath more flowers than anyone had seen in years. At sunrise, the orchards looked as though winter had returned overnight, not with snow, but with millions of white petals glowing beneath the pale Montana sky. Men who had spent 3 seasons watching their trees weaken stood between the rows without speaking. Women stepped from their frontier cabins and covered their mouths. Children ran through the grass while the air trembled with a sound the valley had nearly forgotten. Bees, thousands of them. They moved from tree to tree in a living cloud, carrying pollen across orchards that had produced almost nothing the year before. And at the edge of the largest grove stood 16-year-old Milo Thorne, wearing a patched coat and holding one of the same broken beehive boxes everyone had told him to burn. No one was laughing now. But 7 months earlier, when Milo first began gathering their old beehives, the people of Briar Glen believed he had finally lost what little sense he possessed. It began during the dry autumn of 1891. Briar Glen sat between low-timbered ridges and open prairie, far from the nearest railway line. Most families survived through a mixture of frontier farming, livestock care, food preservation, and the kind of self-reliance that left little room for wasted effort. Every frontier homestead had its own rhythm. Before dawn, wood stoves were lit. Water was hauled before the wind strengthened. Hay was forked down from the loft. Grain storage bins were checked for mice. Apples were dried. Roots were carried into cellars. And animals were fed before the people who owned them ate breakfast. In such a place, usefulness was the closest thing to wealth. Milo understood that better than most. His father, Nathaniel Thorne, had died 2 winters earlier when a wagon overturned on an icy slope above the northern pass. Since then, Milo lived with his mother, Ruth, and his younger sister, Nell, in a small stone cabin at the edge of an abandoned pear orchard. The cabin had only 2 rooms. Its roof leaked near the chimney. Their root cellar flooded every spring, and the horse barn leaned several inches toward the east whenever prairie winds struck it broadside. Yet Ruth kept the home clean, Nell kept the stove fed, and Milo handled the work that would normally have belonged to 2 grown men. He repaired fences. He cut firewood. He carried water. He worked as a ranch hand when neighboring families needed help. He also watched. That was what separated Milo from nearly everyone else in Briar Glen. While other boys measured a man by how hard he could swing an axe, Milo noticed where frost settled first. He watched which side of a snow shelter hardened under changing wind. He studied how mice entered grain sheds, how cattle formed circles during sudden storms, and how moisture gathered beneath poorly stacked hay. His father had once told him, "Frontier survival begins before danger arrives. Most people look when they are afraid. The wise learn to look while the world is still quiet." Milo remembered those words. That autumn, the valley was quiet in a way that troubled him. The orchards had bloomed poorly in spring. Summer fruit had been small, twisted, and scarce. Several farmers blamed drought. Others blamed late frost. Some said the soil had simply been exhausted by decades of use. Milo suspected something else. He had noticed fewer bees. Years earlier, wild colonies had nested in hollow cottonwoods along the creek. Several homesteaders also kept wooden hives near their gardens. But hard winters, disease, neglect, and repeated bear damage had destroyed most of them. One by one, the empty boxes had been dragged behind barns, stacked beside sheds, or thrown into rubbish piles. To everyone else, they were rotten lumber. To Milo, they were evidence. The idea came to him while repairing a broken fence at the Bellamy Frontier Ranch. Near the horse barn stood 6 abandoned beehive boxes, gray with age and split along the corners. One had no bottom. Another had been crushed beneath a wagon wheel. All of them smelled faintly of old wax. Milo knelt beside them. He ran a finger along the dark interior of one box and found a thin layer of hardened propolis still clinging to the wood. Bellamy saw him and laughed. Thinking of raising ghosts, boy? Milo looked up. What are you doing with these? Burning them before the snow comes. Could I have them? Bellamy stared at him for a moment, then shouted toward the barn. Henry, come hear this. Thorne's boy wants the bee coffins. 2 ranch hands emerged. Within minutes, Milo stood surrounded by men laughing at the sight of him loading broken hive boxes onto a handcart. One of them shook his head. You need firewood that badly? No, Milo said. Then what do you need rotten boxes for? Milo hesitated. He had learned that unfinished ideas were dangerous things to share. People judged them by what they looked like before they had a chance to work. Still, he answered honestly. I think the orchards are failing because the bees are gone. The laughter stopped for half a second, then returned louder. Bellamy slapped his knee. You hear that? The boy means to repair the valley with insects. Another man called after him as he pulled the cart away. Be sure to tell the apples help is coming. By evening, the story had traveled farther than Milo had. At the feed store, men asked whether he planned to teach bees how to plow. At the blacksmith's shop, someone left a dead wasp on his cart. Children followed him through town chanting, Bee boy, bee boy! Milo said nothing. He visited every homestead he could reach before dark. Some people gave him their old hives for free. Others demanded he haul away additional scrap wood in exchange. A few refused, convinced he was collecting material to resell. By the end of the week, 17 damaged boxes stood behind the Thorne cabin. By the end of the month, there were 32. Ruth watched the pile grow with increasing concern. Milo, she said one evening, we need the yard cleared before winter, I know. And those boxes won't keep us warm, I know. They won't feed Nell, I know. His mother looked at him across the kitchen table. Lamplight softened the fatigue around her eyes. Then tell me what you see that everyone else does not. Milo unfolded a rough map he had drawn on a flour sack. He had marked every orchard, every surviving garden, every creek hollow, and every place where he had seen bees during summer. The marks were sparse. The trees are still flowering, he explained, but not enough pollen is moving between them. Some orchards have blossoms and almost no fruit. Others produce only on the edge nearest wildflowers. The soil may be tired. The weather may be part of it. But those things don't explain everything. Ruth studied the map. And the broken hives? If I can repair them before spring, maybe I can catch wild swarms. Do you know how? No. Do you know anyone who does? Milo looked toward the dark window. Not yet. That answer should have ended the plan. Instead, it became the first real step. For the next 3 weeks, Milo separated usable boards from rotten ones. He heated bent nails over the wood stove and hammered them straight. He repaired joints with wooden pegs, sealed cracks with pine resin, and built missing bottoms from old feed crates. What he could not replace, he redesigned. This was Homestead Survival in its simplest form, not having what was needed and refusing to let that be the end of the matter. Yet the deeper Milo worked, the more questions appeared. How large should an entrance be? How much cold could a hive withstand? Would old wax attract bees or disease? Should the boxes face south? Could a colony survive a prairie winter without shelter from the wind? He had repaired 32 hives, but he had no bees and no teacher. Then, on the first truly cold morning of November, Milo found a message carved into the frost on one of the hive lids. 3 words. You built them wrong. Milo spun around. Beyond the fence, an old man stood beneath the cottonwoods, holding a smoker in one hand and watching him as though he had been waiting for months. And before Milo could ask his name, the stranger pointed toward the repaired hives and said, Those boxes won't save a single colony. He paused. But the boy who built them might. The old man didn't bother introducing himself. Instead, he picked up one of Milo's repaired hive boxes, turned it upside down, and knocked twice against the bottom board with his knuckles. The hollow sound echoed across the frosted yard. Too much empty space, he said quietly. He moved to another box, ran his fingers along the entrance slot, then shook his head again. This opening is wide enough for winter wind to march straight through. A third hive received the same silent inspection. The roof sheds rain, he admitted. That's good. Then he looked directly at Milo. But you've built these boxes for yourself. He tapped the weathered pine. Not for the bees. The words landed harder than any insult Milo had heard from the men in town. Because they were true. The laughter at the feed store hadn't bothered him. Neither had the children calling him Bee Boy. But realizing he had spent nearly 6 weeks rebuilding 32 hives without understanding the creatures meant to live inside them. That stung. The stranger finally extended his hand. My name is Elias Crow. Milo recognized it immediately. Nearly everyone in Briar Glen did. Years earlier, before disease swept through much of the valley's bee population, Elias had supplied honey, beeswax, and pollination colonies to ranches and frontier homesteads across 3 counties. Orchard owners once scheduled their planting around his colonies. Children remembered barrels of golden comb stacked beside his wagon every autumn. Then, almost overnight, he had disappeared from public life. Some said he had lost every colony during an unusually severe prairie winter. Others claimed bears destroyed his apiaries. A few whispered that old age had finally caught him. Only now did Milo notice the smoker hanging from the man's belt, polished smooth from decades of use. It wasn't the tool of someone who had abandoned bees. It belonged to someone who still listened to them. "You've been watching me," Milo said, "for longer than you realize." "Why?" Elisa smiled faintly. "Because everyone else watched the broken boxes." He looked toward the repaired hives. "I watched the boy carrying them." The following morning, long before sunrise painted the eastern prairie, Milo walked nearly 3 miles to Elias Crow's property. Calling it a ranch would have been generous. The place looked forgotten. A weathered stone cabin stood beneath towering cottonwoods beside a narrow creek. Smoke drifted lazily from a squat chimney. Nearby sat an aging horse barn with one sagging corner, small homestead garden already covered by frost, and rows of wooden hive stands stretching toward the tree line. Most of them were empty, not abandoned, simply waiting. That difference mattered. Inside the cabin, shelves overflowed with notebooks instead of valuables, drawings of wildflowers, maps of blooming seasons, weather records spanning decades, sketches of bee anatomy, handwritten observations. Milo had expected secrets. Instead, he found patience written thousands of times in different forms. Elias placed a kettle on the wood stove. Most people think beekeeping is about honey. He poured coffee into 2 dented cups. "It isn't. It's about bees?" Elias shook his head. "It's about paying attention." The old beekeeper led Milo toward a single surviving colony sheltered behind a natural windbreak of cedar trees. Unlike the rough boxes stacked behind Milo's cabin, this hive looked almost ordinary. No polished brass, no elaborate craftsmanship, just weathered pine darkened by years of rain and sunlight. Thousands of bees moved calmly across the entrance despite the cold morning. Milo instinctively stepped closer. Elias raised a hand. "Stop." Milo froze. "What do you hear?" "Here, close your eyes." Confused, Milo obeyed. For several moments, he heard only wind sliding through cedar branches. Then another sound slowly emerged. A low, steady vibration, not loud, not frantic, calm, distant. "What does it mean?" Milo asked. "It means they're calm. You can tell that? I don't watch bees first," Elias smiled. "I listen." He pointed toward the entrance. "A frightened colony sounds different. So does a hungry one. So does a queenless hive. So does a colony preparing to swarm. The language changes long before the eye notices." Milo opened his eyes again. He suddenly realized he had spent weeks studying wood while ignoring the creatures themselves. Over the next several days, Elias refused to let Milo touch a single hive tool. Instead, every lesson began somewhere unexpected. They watched patches of clover. They timed which flowers opened first after sunrise. They compared warm slopes with shaded hollows. They observed how bees approached water. Sometimes they spent an entire afternoon saying almost nothing. On the 4th day, Milo finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "When will we start catching bees?" Elias chuckled. "When you stop trying." Milo frowned. "I don't understand." "Exactly." The old man picked up a dried apple. "Tell me why a hungry horse enters a barn." "Because there's hay." "And why does a swallow return to the same nest?" "It remembers." "And why would a swarm choose one empty box over another?" Milo hesitated. "I don't know." Elias broke the apple in half. "People imagine bees looking for empty space. They're wrong. They're looking for a place that already feels alive." That afternoon, Elias carried one of Milo's repaired hive boxes into the workshop. He didn't criticize the craftsmanship. Instead, he opened a small wooden chest. Inside lay pieces of old honeycomb blackened with age, tiny flakes of beeswax, propolis scraped from decades-old colonies. The aroma filled the room instantly, warm, sweet, earthy. "This," Elias said softly, "is memory." He rubbed a small amount of softened wax onto the inside walls of the hive. "Wood tells bees nothing. But wax," he smiled. "Wax tells stories." Milo watched carefully. "You mean they'll smell it? They'll recognize it. Like coming home?" Elias nodded. "Exactly." He explained that wild swarms searched for more than shelter. Scouts bees preferred cavities carrying familiar scents. Old wax, propolis, traces left by healthy colonies. Those smells suggested generations had already survived there. Nature trusted experience. So did bees. Frontier wisdom, Elias often said, worked much the same way. Traditional skills survived because someone had already tested them against failure. By late November, Milo had rebuilt nearly every hive a second time. The entrances were narrower. The roofs extended farther beyond the walls. The interiors carried fresh beeswax and propolis instead of bare lumber. Ventilation changed. Drainage improved. Even the orientation of each hive stand shifted slightly toward the morning sun while remaining protected from prevailing winter winds. It was no longer simply carpentry. It had become frontier engineering. Every change answered a question Milo had never known to ask. Yet despite all the improvements, something still bothered him. If spring comes, he asked one evening, how do we know where to place them? Elias spread another map across the kitchen table. Not a map of property lines, a map of flowers, wild plum, goldenrod, willow, apple, pear, blackberry, basswood, clover. Each bloom had been recorded according to season, elevation, rainfall, and sunlight. The bees don't care where your fence stands, Elias said. They care where life grows. He traced invisible paths connecting creek banks to orchards, abandoned fields to homestead gardens, flowering weeds beside wagon roads to forgotten meadows beyond the valley. Milo stared in silence. He had been thinking about individual hives. Elias was thinking about an entire living network. For the first time, Milo understood that restoring bees was never really about restoring bees. It was about restoring relationships between flowers, trees, water, soil, animals, people. One broken link weakened every other. Word continued spreading through Briar Glen. Whenever Milo passed through town collecting nails, pine boards, or lamp oil, someone found a joke waiting. How many conversations have you had with insects today? Did your bees teach you arithmetic yet? Planning to pollinate the whole territory by yourself. Even some orchard owners dismissed the idea. The valley has bigger problems than bees. Milo no longer argued. He simply smiled. Because Elias had taught him another lesson. The loudest people usually observed the least. Winter arrived early that year. A sharp frontier blizzard swept across the prairie before Thanksgiving, burying fence posts beneath drifting snow and forcing families deeper into their frontier cabins. For nearly a week, Milo couldn't visit Elias. The roads disappeared. Creeks froze. Even livestock struggled to reach sheltered ground. At last, when the skies cleared, Milo hurried through knee-deep snow toward the old apiary. Something felt wrong the moment he arrived. The surviving hive was strangely quiet. Not silent, but quieter than before. Elias stood beside it without speaking. He removed the outer cover slowly. Milo expected to see dead bees. Instead, he saw something even more alarming. The honey stores were almost gone. The colony was alive, but barely. Elias closed the lid gently. Then he looked at Milo. If they don't survive this winter, he paused, letting the weight of the sentence settle between them. There won't be a single healthy colony left in Briar Glen for your new hives. The repaired boxes suddenly seemed meaningless. Spring was still months away, and the future of every orchard in the valley now depended on saving the very last strong colony before winter claimed it forever. For nearly 3 weeks after the last snow melted, nothing happened. Every dawn, Milo Thorne walked the same narrow path through the abandoned pear orchard beside his family's stone cabin. He checked each repaired hive, rested a hand on the weathered wood, then continued to the next one. Every evening, he repeated the journey. 32 hives, 32 empty entrances. Not a single bee, the valley noticed. Whenever Milo passed the feed store with another bundle of lumber or a bucket of fresh water for the shallow drinking pans he had placed among the trees, someone found a new joke waiting. Your tenants haven't moved in yet? Another man laughed. Maybe the bees heard your rent was too high. Even Mr. Bellamy, who had given Milo his first broken hive, called across the road. You've rebuilt a whole neighborhood for insects. Shame nobody wants to live there. Months earlier, those words would have embarrassed Milo. Now they only reminded him of something Elias Crow had said. Nature doesn't answer to impatience. It answers to preparation. So Milo kept preparing. He planted patches of white clover beneath the orchard. He repaired cracked water troughs so bees could drink safely without drowning. He left flowering weeds untouched instead of cutting them away. Every small task seemed insignificant by itself, yet together they formed something Elias called a living invitation. You don't catch bees, the old beekeeper often reminded him. You create a place worth choosing. Late in April, Milo found Elias standing beside an ancient cottonwood along Willow Creek. The old man wasn't looking at the tree. He was watching the sky. What do you see? Milo asked. I see scouts. At first Milo saw nothing unusual. Then tiny movements caught his eye. Single bees flew outward from a hollow high in the cottonwood, circling farther each time before disappearing across the valley. "They're searching," Elias said quietly. "For another home." Milo's heart began to race. "My hives? Perhaps. But remember this." Elias looked at him with the calm patience of a man who had trusted nature longer than most people trusted themselves. "Scout bees don't choose the nearest home. They choose the best one." 3 days passed, then 5, nothing. On the morning of the 6th day, Milo almost decided not to check the orchard before breakfast, almost. Halfway across the field he stopped. The air felt different, not louder, fuller. He listened. A low hum drifted across the still morning. It grew steadily until it became a living vibration rolling through the valley like distant thunder. Milo looked up. His breath caught. A dark cloud was moving above the orchard, not smoke, not birds, bees, thousands upon thousands of them. The swarm turned slowly beneath the spring sunlight, rising and falling like a single living creature. The sound filled every corner of the orchard until even the leaves seemed to tremble. "Mama!" Nell shouted from the cabin porch. "They're here!" Ruth stepped outside, wiping flour from her hands. She stared upward without speaking. Within minutes, neighbors began arriving, drawn by the strange sound echoing across the fields. Mr. Bellamy rode in first. Behind him came several orchard owners. The same men who had laughed all winter now stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the flowering trees. No one joked, no one moved. The swarm circled once, then again. Thousands of scout bees separated from the cloud, racing toward Milo's repaired hives. One entered, another followed, then dozens. The entire valley seemed to stop breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Bellamy whispered, almost to himself. "They're leaving." Elias quietly shook his head. "No, they're deciding." The silence became almost unbearable. Then, without warning, the swarm changed. The great cloud folded inward as though an invisible hand had gently gathered it together. Wave after wave of bees flowed toward a single weathered hive. Not chaotically, not frantically, gracefully. The entrance disappeared beneath a river of golden bodies moving with quiet purpose. Children watched with wide eyes. Ranchers removed their hats. Even the horses stood strangely still. Milo felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered dragging these broken boxes home through laughter. He remembered cold evenings hammering bent nails straight beside the wood stove. He remembered wondering whether everyone else had been right. Now thousands of living creatures were answering a question no person in Briar Glen had believed worth asking. When the last cluster vanished inside the hive, the orchard became almost silent again. Only a gentle hum remained. Elias rested one hand on Milo's shoulder. "You never forced them. You simply built something they trusted." For the next week, 2 more wild swarms arrived. Then another. Not every repaired hive found new occupants. Many remained empty, but that didn't matter. The orchard was alive again. Each warm afternoon, bees drifted from blossom to blossom until the white petals seemed to shimmer beneath their wings. People began noticing small things. Apple flowers remained open longer. Pear blossoms looked fuller. Wild plums along the creek carried more visitors than anyone could remember. Still, most farmers insisted it meant very little. "Pretty to watch," one said. "But flowers don't fill wagons." Bellamy nodded. "We'll see when harvest comes." Elias said nothing. That evening he walked slowly between the trees, studying blossom after blossom. Finally he stopped beneath the oldest pear tree in the orchard. His expression changed. Not with joy, with concern. Milo noticed immediately. "What is it?" The old beekeeper looked toward the hills beyond the valley. "I've spent 40 years watching bees." He reached out and gently touched a blossom covered with fresh pollen. "I've never seen pollination begin this fast." He paused for a long moment. "If I'm right," his voice grew almost inaudible, "this orchard isn't the only thing that's about to change." By the 2nd week of May, Briar Glen no longer sounded like the same valley. Before sunrise, the orchards awakened with thousands of wings. The steady hum drifted across fences, over weathered horse barns, and through open cabin windows until it blended with the songs of meadowlarks returning from the prairie. Farmers who had spent years blaming poor harvests on frost or tired soil found themselves pausing beside their fields for reasons they couldn't explain. Something had changed, not overnight, but quietly enough that only those who looked every day noticed it first. Milo was one of them. Each morning before beginning his chores, he walked the rows of the old pear orchard carrying only a small notebook. Elias had forbidden him from counting bees. "Count the trees," the old beekeeper had said. "The bees are only the messengers." So Milo observed the blossoms instead. The flowers that had once withered after only a few days now remained fresh and full. Tiny green fruit began forming on branches that had stood nearly barren for 3 seasons. Even the oldest pear trees, twisted by decades of prairie wind, seemed determined to try again. It was the first hopeful spring Ruth Thorne could remember since her husband died. One evening, she stood beneath the largest tree while Nell pointed excitedly toward clusters of tiny pears, no larger than marbles. "I've never seen this many," Nell whispered. Ruth smiled, though tears quietly filled her eyes. "Neither have I." The changes spread beyond the thorn orchard. Wild plum trees blooming along Willow Creek carried more fruit than usual. Blackberry patches thickened. Clover fields shimmered with constant movement. Even the vegetable gardens beside scattered frontier homesteads began setting stronger squash, beans, and pumpkins. At first, no one connected these changes. Farmers rarely noticed patterns beyond their own fences, but Elias did. He unfolded another of his weathered maps across the kitchen table inside his stone cabin. Colored marks covered the paper. Red for apple blossoms, blue for pear trees, yellow for clover, green for wildflowers. Thin pencil lines connected them all. Milo stared. "It looks different." "It is. How?" Elias pointed to dozens of new marks. "The bees aren't staying in one orchard. They're creating routes." "Routes?" "They leave one flowering tree carrying pollen. They return through another. They drink at the creek. They visit someone's homestead garden. Then they cross into another ranch." He smiled. "The valley isn't made of separate farms. It has become one living system." For the first time, Milo understood something far larger than beekeeping. Frontier survival was never about protecting one family alone. Every frontier homestead depended upon countless things happening beyond its own fences. News traveled quickly. People who had ignored Milo all winter now slowed their wagons beside his repaired hives. Some asked cautious questions, others simply watched. Even Bellamy rode into the orchard one afternoon carrying no jokes. He climbed down from his horse and studied the busy entrances of 3 occupied hives. "I'll admit something," he finally said. "I didn't expect this." Milo smiled politely. "Neither did I." Bellamy scratched his beard. "My western orchard has more blossoms this year." "You think?" He stopped himself. He wasn't yet ready to say the words aloud. Milo answered anyway. "I think the bees are helping." Bellamy nodded slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, he asked, "If I still have my old hive boxes?" Milo looked at him. "Could they be repaired?" Within days, other farmers arrived carrying broken equipment they had planned to burn. Cracked hive bodies, warped lids, old frames blackened with wax. The same pieces of wood everyone had once called worthless were suddenly stacked outside Milo's barn waiting for repair. Nell laughed as she counted them. "People threw these away. They did. Now they want them back." Milo picked up an old hive roof split nearly in half. They didn't change. The evidence did. Life settled into a new rhythm. Milo repaired hives in the mornings before helping neighboring ranches mend fences or move livestock. Ruth expanded her homestead garden. Nell planted extra herbs beside the cabin to bloom later in summer. Even Elias seemed lighter than before, though he never celebrated too early. "Nature rewards humility," he often reminded Milo. "The moment we think we've mastered it, it finds another lesson." Those words proved true sooner than anyone expected. Near the end of May, Milo noticed something unusual. One hive had become extraordinarily active. Far more bees entered than left. Others clustered outside the entrance despite warm weather. He hurried to Elias. The old beekeeper watched the colony for less than a minute. Then his expression grew serious. "They're preparing to swarm." "But isn't that good?" "It depends. If half this colony leaves now, the young fruit won't receive enough pollination." Milo felt his stomach tighten. The valley had only recently begun believing again. Losing one of the strongest colonies could weaken every surrounding orchard. "What do we do?" Elias answered quietly. "We don't stop nature. We understand it." He picked up his smoker. "This is the lesson I hoped you wouldn't have to learn so soon." The following morning, nearly every orchard owner in Briar Glen awoke to an astonishing sight. The busiest hive in the valley stood almost silent. Its entrance, so crowded the evening before, now held only a handful of workers. Above the orchard, thousands of bees rose into the clear spring sky, swirling higher and higher until the entire valley seemed wrapped inside a living golden cloud. Children pointed upward. Farmers ran from their fields. Even Bellamy abandoned his plow. No one knew where the swarm was going, except Elias. He looked toward the northern ridge beyond the orchards, then turned to Milo. "Bring every empty hive you've repaired." His voice remained calm, but his eyes carried an urgency Milo had never seen before. "Because if we lose this swarm," he paused, "we may lose everything we've just begun to rebuild." The swarm crossed the valley like a living river. Thousands of bees shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, rising above the orchards before drifting toward the northern ridge. Every farmer in Briar Glen stopped what he was doing. Wagons stood abandoned in the road. Horses waited without complaint. Even children fell silent as they watched the golden cloud move steadily across the sky. No one had ever seen anything like it. Milo loaded 4 empty hives onto his wagon while Elias climbed beside him. "Faster," the old beekeeper urged. "They won't wait for us." The horse climbed the ridge as quickly as the rocky trail allowed. By the time they reached the top, the swarm had gathered around a massive white oak overlooking the entire valley. The bees hung together in a single cluster larger than a rain barrel. Perfectly still, perfectly united. Milo instinctively reached for the smoker. Elias stopped him. "Not yet. They're deciding." Again, the same lesson. Nature could never be hurried. Word spread quickly, and before long dozens of townspeople arrived at the ridge. The men who had mocked Milo throughout the winter now stood quietly beneath the great oak, looking up in amazement. No one laughed. No one offered advice. For the first time, they simply watched. Elias placed one repaired hive beneath a low branch where the cluster hung. Then he stepped back. We wait. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The valley grew so quiet that everyone could hear the steady humming of thousands of wings. Then something extraordinary happened. A handful of scout bees landed at the entrance of the empty hive. They disappeared inside. Moments later, they emerged again, circling the cluster before returning. More scouts followed, then more. The movement spread through the swarm like a whispered conversation. Suddenly, without confusion or panic, the hanging cluster began to loosen. Streams of bees lifted into the air before flowing gracefully toward the waiting hive. The entrance darkened beneath thousands of tiny bodies. Children gasped. Several women covered their mouths. Bellamy removed his hat. No one spoke until the last bees disappeared inside. Finally, the old rancher broke the silence. "I thought the boy was collecting broken boxes." He looked at Milo. "But he was rebuilding the valley." That single sentence changed everything. Within days, farmers who had laughed all winter began searching their own barns, haylofts, and forgotten sheds for abandoned hive equipment. Wagons arrived daily at Milo's cabin carrying cracked boxes, warped lids, and weathered frames once destined for the fire. Instead of jokes, they brought questions. "Can this one be repaired? Where should I place it? What flowers should I plant?" Milo answered every question the same way Elias had answered his, patiently, without pride, because the lesson had never belonged to him alone. As spring turned toward early summer, the orchards revealed what no one had expected. Branches bent beneath young fruit. Apple trees that had struggled for years carried heavy clusters. Pears covered limbs once considered barren. Wild blackberry patches spread farther along the creek than anyone remembered. Even vegetable gardens produced stronger beans, squash, and cucumbers. For the first time in many seasons, families began speaking about abundance instead of merely surviving another year. People credited rain. They credited warmer weather. Some even called it luck. Elias quietly shook his head. It wasn't luck. It was connection. He unfolded his old map one final time. New pencil lines now stretched across nearly the entire valley. Every orchard, every meadow, every creek, every homestead garden. The bees had tied them together into one living network. People thought each farm stood alone, he said. They never realized nature ignores fence lines. Early one morning, Bellamy rode to the thorn cabin carrying something wrapped in canvas. Without saying a word, he laid it on the porch. It was the first broken hive he had given Milo months earlier, only now it had been carefully cleaned. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "I laughed because I couldn't see what you saw," Milo smiled. "You didn't need to. You only needed to look again." Bellamy nodded. "So, will you teach me?" For a moment, Milo saw himself standing where Bellamy now stood, full of questions, uncertain, hoping someone wiser would answer. He heard Elias's voice in his memory. "Knowledge only survives when it is shared." Milo picked up the old hive. "Let's begin." By midsummer, the busiest place in Briar Glen was no longer the feed store. It was the small workshop behind the thorn cabin. Farmers repaired hives together. Children learned to recognize flowering plants. Women planted herbs and clover around their gardens. Even travelers passing through the valley stopped to ask why the orchards seemed unusually alive. No one answered with stories about miracles. They pointed toward the bees, and toward the quiet young man who had listened when everyone else had laughed. Watching from beneath the shade of the old oak, Elias smiled with quiet satisfaction. The valley had finally understood. Not that bees could save an orchard, But that one overlooked idea, patiently nurtured, could change an entire community. And before the summer ended, Briar Glen would face its richest harvest in more than 20 years. A harvest that would prove the greatest miracle had never been the bees at all. By early September, Briar Glen looked like a valley reborn. Wagons rolled slowly beneath the weight of overflowing baskets. Apple branches bowed low with fruit. Pear trees that many families had nearly cut down the previous winter now required wooden supports to keep their limbs from breaking. Even the abandoned corners of old homesteads seemed alive again, filled with wildflowers, clover, and the steady hum of bees moving from blossom to blossom. No one spoke of miracles anymore. They spoke of preparation, they spoke of patience, and, more often than not, they spoke of a quiet young man who had seen value where everyone else had seen only broken wood. One afternoon, as the harvest festival filled the town square, the county recorder announced the year's crop totals. Apples had produced nearly a third more fruit than the valley's average over the previous decade. Pear harvests reached levels no one under 40 had ever witnessed. Vegetable gardens across Briar Glen yielded stronger crops, and even nearby ranches reported healthier clover fields for their livestock. The numbers surprised everyone, except Elias. "They're measuring wagons," he said softly to Milo. "I'm measuring roots," Milo smiled. He finally understood. The harvest had never begun in autumn. It had begun months earlier, the moment people started caring for something they could not immediately see. Before the first frost arrived, families gathered beneath the old white oak where the great swarm had settled that spring. Bellamy stood before the crowd, holding the weathered hive he had once mocked. "I've repaired this one myself," he admitted with a grin. The crowd laughed warmly. Not at him, with him. "I used to believe experience meant having all the answers," Bellamy continued. "But this year a young man taught me that experience also means knowing when to admit you've been wrong." He turned toward Milo. "Thank you." There was no applause, only dozens of quiet nods. On the frontier, respect was rarely loud, it was earned. As the afternoon faded, Elias and Milo walked once more through the old pear orchard. The trees glowed beneath the golden light of early autumn. Bees still drifted lazily between the last late-season blossoms, preparing for another winter. Elias stopped beside the very first hive Milo had repaired. Its wood had already begun weathering into the same soft gray as the older boxes. "Do you know why old orchards survive longer than people?" he asked. Milo shook his head. "Because every season leaves something behind." He rested a hand against the hive. "A tree remembers every spring. The soil remembers every rain. And people?" He looked across the valley where children now carried small hive boxes they had built with their parents. "People remember the lessons that changed them." A gentle breeze carried the scent of ripe pears through the orchard. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Words were unnecessary. The valley itself was telling the story now. Years later, travelers passing through Briar Glen often admired its thriving orchards and healthy bee colonies. Some assumed the valley had always been prosperous. Others credited unusually fertile soil. Only the oldest residents remembered the truth. They remembered the winter when broken beehives were piled like firewood. They remembered the laughter that followed a teenage boy pulling those forgotten boxes home one by one. And they remembered the spring when the bees chose to return. Not because anyone forced them, but because someone had quietly prepared a place worthy of trust. That story became part of the valley's frontier wisdom, passed from one generation to the next, not as a lesson about bees, but as a reminder that the greatest changes often begin with ideas the world laughs at first. Sometimes the future doesn't arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives on thousands of tiny wings. Thank you for spending this journey with Frontier Survival Wisdom. If this story reminded you that patience, preparation, and quiet perseverance can change far more than we imagine, we'd love to hear from you. What moment stayed with you the most? Was it Milo refusing to give up after months of ridicule? The breathtaking moment the swarm chose its new home? Or the day the entire valley finally understood what he had been building all along? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone, and your stories help keep the spirit of frontier resilience alive. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Frontier Survival Wisdom, like this video, and share it with someone who appreciates the timeless lessons of self-reliance, homesteading, and the wisdom of the American frontier. Until our next journey, remember, nature rewards those who prepare long before the harvest arrives.